Hello, this is Bob. I want to show you the usdebtclock.org website, which documents the current status of our financial situation here in the United States. And you'll find it very interesting. I'm not sure you've ever been to the site before, but if not, you'll find it to have quite a bit of information on just one screen. So what you're going to look at here is we're looking at all the finances and performance data for the United States government. So what you see over here, for example, is the U.S. debt, total debt. Whether or not that's total or not, it's not clear. The reason I say that is the government's been rumored to falsify some of this information or not to report all the true debt that it has. But let's assume for the moment that this is accurate at $18 trillion. And here you'll see our federal tax revenue, which is about 3.1 trillion. Seems like a lot of money. Then you look at the spending that the government does, it's 3.6 trillion, of which 492 billion is a deficit. So they calculate that simply by taking this number and subtracting the revenue, and then you end up with, the shortfall. Based on this tax revenue, if you attempted to pay off the debt without paying any other expenses for the year, you simply would take this amount here and divide it by this amount. It would take you about 6 years to pay off the debt without paying for any other services or what have you. And of course, that's impractical. But it gives you an idea that you know yourself, if you take a loan out for a car or something, you apportion so much of your income to pay for that car over so many years. And you keep the rest of the money, of course, to meet your daily needs, your other costs. Well, if you can see that, here's our spending and here's our revenue, we never get to spend, really, we never really get to pay down the debt. Now, why do I say that? Because you'll look at this number here, which is the interest on the debt, $242 billion we pay to borrow this amount of money. And guess what, by the way? We pay that to the Federal Reserve, believe it or not. The Federal Reserve charges us interest. If we didn't have the Federal Reserve and we just had our own Treasury Department, which we do have a Treasury Department, but apparently they don't do this, the Fed charges us interest, just like a bank would, just like a third party would, because they're really not part of our government. They are a private organization, the Fed. But in any event, that's a subject for a whole other video. But here we pay $242 billion a year to borrow that amount of money. So basically, in the budget that we have, the spending includes that line item. So we have a $242 billion line item in the budget to pay the interest on that debt, but it does nothing to pay down the debt. The debt just sits there if we were to pay the interest, except it gets bigger because we borrow, or I should say we overspend our budget by about 492 billion. And that adds on to this number. So year after year, this number goes up by about $500 billion. We cover the debt, the interest I should say, on the debt, but we continually add more money to it. So this number gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I can show you by means of this debt clock. Let me go to this right now. This allows us to go back in time. So we can go back to, let's say, 2000. Let's go back to 2000. You see this chart up here. And let's look at the debt in the year 2000. The debt in the year 2000 was only 5.7 trillion. Now you recall on the screen we were just looking at, it was 18 trillion. 18 trillion, 15 years after this, it's gone up over 300%. And the debt, interest on the debt, was still pretty hefty at 226 billion. It's funny, maybe the interest rates have gone down. In fact, that's exactly what happened. For a moment there, I was wondering, why is that interest so high relative to the lower debt? And it's exactly that reason. The interest rates today are very low, as we all know. That really benefits the the Fed and the government, because they don't have to pay a lot of interest. If the interest rates were at the historical rates, let's say 5%, that interest on the debt in the year that we're in right now, which is 2015, would be really, really large, okay? But anyway, I just wanted to give you an idea there that, the spending was 1.7 million, so it's about double of that in the last 15 years. Yet the debt went up over 3 times. So let's go back now to the current time period, which will be 2015. We're back now where it's 18 trillion. So you wonder, why does this really matter to you, right? Well, why it matters to you is that we're in big time debt right now, and we're going to continue to be in debt far greater than we could ever pay for. So our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, and even beyond that, have no hope of ever paying down this debt. This debt is so big, and the spending practices that we have right now, you can see that it's not going to ever get paid. So I just wanted to show you that. That's a pretty interesting section there. Most people don't realize this. They have no clue as to what the income is versus the spending, and with the deficit year after year after year. And during the Bush years, it was even worse, because they would hide 500 billion or more at the shake of a finger to go into Iraq and Afghanistan. It would be off the budget. It wouldn't be part of the defense budget. And down here you can see what the defense budget is. Well, when we were and that's our steady state case, by the way. That may include, I'm going to guess, 100 billion for Afghanistan or something. But in general, the day-to-day goings on of the Defense Department are about $500 billion. Back in the Bush days, you still had that day-to-day expense of running the military, but they also had another $500 billion on there that didn't show up here, by the way. It never showed up on this chart, but it went into the spending. It sort of like magically just appeared there. It's like doing a budget with your family and having a line item show up that no one ever discussed, but just showed up there, and it ate up any leftover money you might have had at the end of the year. Well, that's what that did. By keeping things off the budget, which goes against every accounting principle that I'm aware of, that created this. That helped create this mess that we have right there, from all the wars and things like that. So anyway, it's important that you understand that part of the process. Here's something else that's pretty interesting. If you look over in this section here, you see income tax revenue. You don't know. So part of this tax revenue we see at 3 trillion, 1.5 trillion is from income tax revenue. That's you and I paying income, and also, well, it's you and I paying income tax, and then you have corporation tax revenue over here. You also have payroll tax. Payroll tax is Medicaid or Medicare and Social Security, okay, and those types of expenses. And of course, when you look at this number and then you look at what we actually spend for those line items over here, you'll find out that that's not enough money. But in any event, this is what that number is comprised of. So you have these different numbers here. But it's interesting to see that corporations really only pay about, I don't know, 25% of the total tax base. Yet they seem to get 100% of the Congress's attention. Isn't it odd that we fund most of the government right here, and the corporations pay this amount over here? In fact, it'd be interesting to look year after year to see how that's gone up or down. With all the companies going offshore and avoiding federal income tax, it'd be interesting to see what that number is. And we can do that, by the way, with the debt clock time machine up here. But I'm not going to go there right now because I don't want to drag this thing out worse than it already is. But anyway, that's something you can look at. But remember, we're the ones that are paying the tab here, the American citizens, not the corporations. These guys, as far as I'm concerned, and with this ratio of payments, they're second-class citizens. We need them, of course. We need them for jobs, but their tax revenue is really a small amount, relatively speaking. So I think that's important for us to to note. A follow-up on that point, incidentally, is whenever you hear of a recovery in the economy, you'll oftentimes hear the pundits on TV say, well, the consumers aren't spending, they're not buying, and that's holding everything back. You know, they're exactly right. When there's a recovery, it isn't corporations that turn it around. Um, it's the citizens. If you don't buy the goods that the corporations make, whether you're another business, you know, buying Caterpillar tractors or Boeing jets or whatever it is, keep in mind that the thing that drives all that demand, whether it be new construction, new airplane builds, is all based on consumers traveling, buying, and consuming. Corporations only consume and build in response to demand that comes from others. So if you don't have others creating the demand or trying to purchase items to meet their needs, then you're not going to have a recovery. And oftentimes you'll see the stock market doing really well based on some other crazy formulas that they utilize. But the consumers are sitting at home watching TV and they're not buying anything. And when that happens, you don't have a recovery. Recovery is not possible without the consumers. And this is just an indicator of why that is. This is all the income tax they're paying. And guess what? They pay income tax in response to things they earn. And then they typically go out and spend whatever they earn. And at least that's the way it's been in the past. Let's go back to the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security numbers. Medicare outspends Social Security, which is very interesting because any wage earner will tell you that they only put in, I think it's 1.2% of their paycheck into Medicare, up to a certain limit, which is over 100,000, I know, but then Social Security gets a much bigger dose of cash from the wage earner, and the corporations have to match that. Of course, the corporations have to match the Medicare as well. But it's interesting to see that this is outspending Social Security. And if you total those two together, you end up with about 1.8 trillion. And look at this. This is 1 trillion. So you have payroll tax revenue. This is the amount of money going in, and that's the amount of money going out. Now, of course, the money that's going out was supposedly put in there a long time ago, so you would expect that it would be a higher amount than what's going in. But if you've got more going out than you've got coming in, it doesn't take a mathematician to figure this out, that you're going to have a problem. And unless you have a big savings amount somewhere that they haven't told us about, you're going to run into a problem. So I think it's pretty clear that that whole system is in trouble. Here's some other interesting information on here. In fact, all this information is interesting on this page. And once again, if I haven't mentioned it already, all this data comes from government systems. It's just simply pulled from those systems and then straight line based on algorithms because they know what the growth rate that's occurring that over the period of time that we're dealing with. In this case, it's 2015. I was going to say 1915. It sort of feels like 1915 in some ways. But in any event, you can see here the U.S. population is 320 million. This tells us the number of taxpayers, 118 million taxpayers. You have a workforce of 148 million in the workforce. In the year 2000, it was actually higher, believe it or not. We actually had more, about 5 million more workers than we do now, even though the population has gone way up. Now, why would that be? Well, I don't know. There's a lot more people not in the labor force, the workforce, than there were back in 2000. Quite a difference there. We do have a lot of self-employed, but that's not an issue there. You have a lot of part-time workers. I'd have to go back in the time clock here to see what it was back in that period, but you can do that. In any event, you can see quite a bit of information here. You see union workers. Median income now is 28.7. 28.7. Back in 2000, it was 28.3. 15 years have gone by, and we've gained a few $100s in income. That's going backwards. That's a real problem. Yet look at the median home price, 282 now, 282,000 versus 171,000 then. Bankruptcies are shown here. I don't know what the bankruptcies were back then. You can look at the time machine. Prison inmates, I guarantee you this number's way up. Convicted felons. U.S. veterans, got a lot of U.S. veterans, 21 million. I wonder how many of them have been injured, by the way. But that number's pretty high. They don't show that number, but I'll bet you that number's pretty high. And look at the number of veterans compared to the size of the armed forces. So obviously we know that there were some big wars in the past 10 years that have caused that big growth in the U.S. veteran population. Plus the veterans are probably living longer, assuming the VA is doing what they're supposed to, which is keeping them healthy. U.S. retirees, 48 million. That's a big number. People living in poverty, 44 million. Medicare people, 55.9 million. Food stamp recipients, 45 million. Total receiving benefits is 159 million. And remember, that's about 160 million. And you have 320 million population. So 50% of the population is receiving some type of benefit from the U.S. government. Down the bottom here, there's some assets and liability statements. You'll notice that small business assets, corporation assets, household assets total $115 trillion of assets. Seems pretty good. But once again, look at the household versus the corporation. Much more value here by the citizenry than corporations. Very interesting to see that, I think. Let's see. These are future liabilities. You have Social Security liability at 13 trillion. Medicare liability at 27 trillion, by the way, double the Social Security. Isn't that interesting? When's the last time you heard of your politician talking about Medicare? They talk about Social Security because they're driven primarily by big corporations to get out of the Social Security business here at the government and to go into Wall Street type situations where people invest money. They don't ever talk about Medicare, but Medicare is a much bigger problem. Partly because we don't put enough money into Medicare, because we have a population now that's going to be aging big time as we baby boomers start needing medical care, and of course the medical industry is out of control in terms of cost control. So this number is just going to go skyward, like it's already been. Anyway, the U.S. unfunded liabilities is $95 trillion. Liability per taxpayer, based on all this, is $800,000 per taxpayer, not per citizen. So in any event, that looks pretty scary in and of itself. If you just look at that number, you'd be pretty frightened, I would think. Here's some more interesting information on here. Manufacturing jobs now are 12.3 million. Manufacturing jobs back in 2000 were 19 million. So we lost about, 7 million? That's very interesting and very disturbing, of course. This U.S. debt clock also has the ability to look at state debt. So I can go look at my state, North Carolina. They don't give us much data here. I'm not sure, you can't dig down to get it, but it gives you some very basic information. That screen I was just describing where the U.S. it's at 74. Compare that to Russia, which is 7 times. In other words, Russia has a lot less debt to produce output than what we do. If you look at China, it's a lot less. But the countries that have been living high on the hog, which is U.S., UK, and the UK is even worse than we are. Look at that, 91, almost 92%. That's really bad. Even Mexico, as I recall, is not nearly as bad as the U.S. and UK. Ireland's in big trouble, 126. Italy, 134. Japan, really serious trouble. We've known that for decades now, since the 90s. They're in very, very serious trouble over in Japan. You know, the Fed's program of printing money, actually they don't print the money per se, they simply do a computer entry and they increase the amount of money that can be transferred to certain parties. Okay, so they don't actually print money in the traditional sense you were thinking of, but they've created a lot of money in the last few years. Now look at the monetary base, 2015 versus the monetary base in 2000. 604 billion, I guess, versus 4 trillion. That's up 7 times, I guess 568% in that period of time. Same thing with the M2 money supply, Treasury securities. So this whole financial part of the equation here is also essentially catastrophic. You know, they've been printing more money with nothing behind it, by the way. There's nothing behind this money. This is just created on a computer. And that that really reduces the value of your dollars that you have in your wallet right now. Anyway, I thought this chart would be interesting. There's no place on the planet that I know of where you can get this amount of information on one computer screen at the same time. Uh, Most people will look at this and get well, they'll be disappointed, of course, but they'll look at it and say, geez, I don't want to understand that data. That's not affecting me. Well, let me tell you, it's affecting you, your kids, and the future. And it's so serious that it's going to actually, it's our biggest enemy. It's much bigger than any terrorist organization ever could be. This is the terrorist group right here, the manner in which we're managing our money in this country. I should say mismanaging it. You know, no one in Congress or the Senate, or the House rather, or the Senate should be spending any additional money beyond what they bring in. That should be the first goal of everyone. Don't spend any more money than what you get. And if you need to get more money, then consider raising taxes. I would start on the very rich because they keep getting reductions, while the people on the bottom tend to be getting taxed in less subtle ways. But in any event, they shouldn't be spending any more money than they have, and they shouldn't be spending any money in the Ukraine, Syria, or these other godforsaken places. You've got enough problems right here. You have infrastructure problems. The problem is that the people that are having the Congress spend money are the military-industrial complex. They need a fresh dose of spending I would say every 5 to 8 years. If they don't get that, if they don't have a war come up every periodically, it's like a drug addict who's out of dope. They are completely out of control, and they pay all the all the money to the re-election committees, and that's why all this happens. Pharmaceuticals are right behind them. You know, they're right there as well. But the uh, the military-industrial complex is what's caused most of this problem right here. Plus, we've become, in many ways, the evil empire in the eyes of the world. You know, with our drone attacks on innocent people around the world, you know, we're funding all that. A lot of this money here, this national debt. Guess what? You know, how many people is that responsible for killing? That's the thing you need to look at. We're doing it day in and day out, and it's got to stop. So I would start with your senators and your congressmen. Tell them to stop spending what you don't have, and don't borrow any more money. This is it. We've had it. We're tapped out. If we gave this screen right here a credit report number, it would be the worst credit report number you would ever see in your life. Certainly nothing you would ever want for yourself. And yet these guys are oblivious in Washington. They continue to be oblivious. They ought to all be they either be thrown out of office, or they better correct this problem. And guess what? I don't see them correcting it very soon. So refer to this diagram certainly before you have any meetings with your congressmen or senators, or if you write to them, and remind them of this situation. This is catastrophic. It's really the worst security risk we have in this country at this time. So thanks for listening to me. I know it's a pain in the neck to go through all this, but you need some tough love every now and again, and this is it right here on this screen.